When the movie was being filmed in 1994, one sound in The Sound of Music caused havoc on the set and almost damaged one of the movie's most famous scenes. It wasn't terrible or dramatic. It was humorous, too humorous. It's hilarious that nobody could maintain your integrity. It destroyed take after take. The studio attempted to fix it for thousands of dollars, then decided to utterly conceal the story. It was kept secret for decades until Julie Andrews eventually on live television, I stated the truth. In that gazebo, what actually transpired? Furthermore, why did Christopher Plummer, who detested the movie, consented to remain silent? The story wins over Europe's heart. In the middle of the 1950s, everything began subtly. Back in the year 1956, a Wolfgang Liebeniner, a German producer, made two movies based on Maria von Trapp's The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, a memoir. Die Trapp Family was the first, and it was followed a year later by a sequel. They were emotive, low-budget, and extremely they had a European tone, but they resonated. In West Germany after the war, people were yearning for tales that were inspirational and uplifting. That's exactly what these two movies did. Both movies were huge box office successes. They were actually the largest commercial success as a movie at the time in West Germany. The pleasure of the story didn't end there, it spread like wildfire over Europe and even reached a South American audience. Individuals from various languages and cultures associated with the representation of an Austrian family standing in music, putting love before fear and standing up to the Nazis. However, once the movies were screened for American studios, the response was not very good. In other words, Hollywood believed the films appeared to be a nobody was lining up for the high school play because it was too romantic, too corny, and too foreign, introduce Von Trapps to the American theater. Until a man by the name of Donahue Vincent J. took over. Donahue was a unique director who had recently earned a Tony Award and has a keen sense of what stories would touch people. He was dispatched to scout by Paramount. He screened the German Trapp family films while working on new concepts. Initially, he got the same response as everyone else, awkward and clumsy. However, something unexpected then occurred. He noticed something beneath the antiquated aesthetic and low-budget production. Actual. There was spirit in the story. It was heartfelt. Donahue also mentioned something that was not "you can't make this a film," someone had previously dared to declare. "You must turn that one statement," turned it into a Broadway musical for Mary Martin. Set off a series of events that would result in one of the most successful musicals ever. However, if Maria von Trapp hadn't taken a highly odd step, none of it would have occurred, and some might the $9,000 deal was a horrible business judgment made years ago. Maria von Trapp was not an insider in Hollywood. She didn't have an agent or attorneys to watch out for her. All she was doing was trying to provide for her family. Thus, when German filmmakers arrived, when asked to purchase her life story in the early 1950s, she agreed, but only for a single purchase. Nearly $9,000 in payment. That may sound insignificant, and it was. Even in it wasn't much money in the 1950s. It's roughly $104 after being adjusted for today. $1,000. A small portion of what was coming down, but not bad for a quick deal. The cue. To exacerbate the situation, Maria had signed away more than she was aware of. Later, Hollywood called and offered to purchase her book's title in order to avoid paying for the rights. Problems and simply modify a narrative that was inspired by it. However, Maria refused to back down. She maintained that if the narrative of her family had to be presented completely and honestly, don't pick and choose. The largest Broadway star of the time by the late 1950s was Mary Martin, and her Richard Halliday, the husband, was adamant about telling the Von Trapp tale on stage. However, there was only one issue: nobody was aware of Maria's location. Ultimately, Maria von Trapp was working alongside Father Franz Wasner as a missionary in the Papua New Guinean rainforests, the long-standing musical director of the family. They just had handwritten documents and no phones or internet. Letters. What about those letters? They were not even opened by Maria. Each time they reached a new mission post, a stack of mail would be waiting, frequently containing letters from a couple in America is attempting to discuss Broadway with her. She ripped them apart. In actuality, Maria had no interest in the entertainment industry. Her main goal was to help people in isolated villages, living cheaply, teaching music, and operating clinics. She had no intention of thinking about Broadway. However, an unforeseen event later occurred. When Father Wozner and Maria eventually made their way back to San Francisco was the port of call for the U.S. ship. And there was nobody else at the pier to greet them. Compared to Richard Halliday. He gave Maria 2 tickets to his wife's performance in Annie Get Your Gun. Maria consented to go, most likely out of courtesy. But she was astounded by what she witnessed on that platform. Mary Martin was captivating, strong, and endearing. Although Maria was transported, she still had "I have horrible news to share." She clarified that she had already given the Germans the film rights. Many years ago. Technically, that door was closed. Nevertheless, she provided the pair with an unexpected green light. "You are free to provide it. Your best chance," she advised them. That one opportunity, one informal nod from Maria, would begin one of the greatest Broadway legends. The risk that paid off when producers initially began to take Maria von Trapp's stories seriously. They had a completely different plan, a stage musical. Incorporating traditional Austrian folk songs, like the original songs performed by the Trapp family at concerts, with a few new ones to assist connect the narrative. Imagine classic European charm with a dash of Broadway flair. However, when they asked Oscar Hammerstein and Richard Rodgers to write just one or two, the renowned combo didn't hold back when performing tunes. Hammerstein and Rodgers essentially stated, "Thank you," they didn't want their work to conflict, so they said, "But no thanks, either we write the whole thing or we're out," featuring traditional Austrian songs. Everything or nothing was at stake. And everything changed at that very moment. The producers pressed the pause button. Hammerstein and Rodgers still needed to complete the Flower Drum song. Thus, the new project was put on hold for the time being. However, when they eventually went back to the Von Trapp tale, they completely revamped the idea, including all of the original tunes. Not just any tunes, either. We're discussing timeless songs like Climb Every Mountain, Do-Re-Mi, Edelweiss, and My Favorite Things. Songs that are still sung around the globe today. Next came November 16th, opening night. 119. At Broadway's Luntfontein Theater, the curtain rose with Theodore Bikel as Captain Von Trapp and Mary Martin as Maria. The cost of producing it cost $400,000 to stage, which was a substantial expenditure at the time. However, the buzz was electric. Sales of tickets skyrocketed, eventually bringing in more than $232 million. Just from reservations made in advance. Take a moment to comprehend that there are more than $232 million. Prior to the majority of people having viewed the show. Mary Martin seldom ever took a day off, she only missed just one performance during the whole span. At 1,443, the show ran. Appearances, almost 4 years, until coming to an end in June 1963. However, by the summer of 1960, another issue began to flare up. A competition for the rights to the film. The studios were aware that this was a phenomenon rather than just a hit. The 20th, the winner, Century Fox, spent $1 million, 200 the rights would cost $50,000, or more than $13 million. In the currency of today. That was a startling figure, particularly for a studio that was in serious danger. Why? Because they had almost been devastated by Fox's previous big-budget epic, Cleopatra. It went $15 million over budget and destroyed careers as a result. Fox was bleeding cash. People therefore believed they were insane when they purchased the rights to The Sound of Music. However, there was a cunning little phrase in the contract that said that if the movie made more than $12.5 million, 10% of the earnings would go to the estate of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Howard, co-writer Lindsay genuinely chuckled at it. He didn't believe that figure would be reached by the film. He was completely mistaken. We now reach one of the largest what-ifs in the history of Hollywood casting. Julie Andrews' retaliation, a serious error in Hollywood. Julie Andrews had already mastered the stage by the early 1960s. She was adored for her Broadway performance as Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. Her tone was gorgeous, with an indisputable appeal. However, when the moment came to transform My Fair Lady into a Hollywood ignored her in the movie. She wasn't camera ready, according to the studio executives. To put it another way, they felt she wasn't glamorous enough for the big screen. Thus, rather than they decided to cast Audrey Hepburn, the actress who made the part famous, a decision that Broadway aficionados were taken aback. Although Audrey was exquisite, her singing was not as good as Julie's. Actually, in the movie, the majority of her songs had to be dubbed. Julie was heartbroken. She had carried My Fair Lady for years before being overlooked at a crucial juncture. It was the sort of slight that might have put a career on the line. However, destiny had other ideas. Director Robert Wise was searching for a performer at the same time. From The Sound of Music, Maria Von Trapp. He didn't think Julie would be a good fit until someone showed him a preview of Mary Poppins at Disney. The movie wasn't even complete yet. However, just a handful, let's sign her before anyone else does, Wise remarked, turning to the screenwriter a few minutes in. Julie was given the opportunity to play Maria in exchange for a fixed payment of $250,000. That is around $2.5 million in today's dollars. It was a respectable salary for a rising celebrity, but the catch is that there were no box office receipts, royalties, or bonuses. Cut. That was it, as soon as she cashed that check. In the meanwhile, Mary Martin, who had portrayed Maria on stage, had reached a completely different agreement. She made almost $8 million. Money from her portion of the Broadway earnings. Fox did not consider Andrews to be a large enough celebrity to warrant a back-end contract. They would later regret that choice. Because Mary Poppins became a huge success. Julie Andrews demonstrated that the studio incorrect, she took home the Best Actress Oscar. And she took action after accepting the prize. Cheeky. Jack Warner, who had turned her down for My Fair Lady, was the one she thanked. It was the audience adored this covert form of retaliation. The Sound of Music would nevertheless become her most recognizable part. Despite the fact that the movie would eventually make hundreds of millions of dollars, Julie never received a dime more than that initial flat charge anywhere in the world. She wasn't the only person Fox attempted to undercut. Even though Julie Andrews was already endearing, she played a role that no one wanted. Her on-screen partner was becoming a major headache for everyone behind the scenes. Being the dashing, sulky widower Captain George Von Trapp should have been a dream job. Who gradually develops feelings for Maria. The problem is that no well-known actor expressed interest in playing him. The director, Robert Wise, put everyone to the test. He thought about Sean Connery, who had just as James Bond, he rocked the globe. Additionally, he contacted Richard Burton, who was renowned for his dramatic acting and his tumultuous connection with Elizabeth Taylor. Even Bing Crosby was mentioned as a potential candidate. However, none of them matched the movie's spirit or tone. Others disagreed. Some simply didn't seem correct. Christopher Plummer followed. He was sharp, graceful, and classically schooled. He didn't like the script, though. Not at all. Plummer actually felt that The Sound of Music was very emotional and sweet. He referred to it as behind the scenes of The Sound of Mucus and repeatedly declined the part. But he wasn't interested in the idea of portraying a rigid, emotionally detached parent in a musical. Robert Wise, however, had faith in him. He therefore took a plane to London in order to personally persuade Plummer. Plummer consented, but only on the proviso that he wanted to change the character. He informed the writers that the captain required additional nuance. More heart. Better dialogue. And the majority of first and foremost, he needed a song of his own to express his feelings. That was the end of Edelweiss. Up in the movie. Contrary to popular belief, it is not an Austrian folk song. Hammerstein and Rogers genuinely composed it for Plummer's persona. The plan was to present the captain with a silent, intimate, and vulnerable moment. Despite those modifications, Plummer still fought. He then acknowledged that he had consumed alcohol throughout some of the filming. throughout the recording of the family's large goodbye show to the Nazis, which is perhaps one of the most dramatic scenes. Plummer was genuinely intoxicated. He claimed that it enabled him to overcome the role's rigidity. His performance was effective in spite of all the anxiety. He gave the captain self-respect and self-control, making the character's change from a harsh punisher to a devoted father seem actual. And it was adored by viewers. Here's a crazy twist, though: Christopher Plummer's contract was also flat. No royalties. No back-end agreement. Similar to Julie Andrews, left with a predetermined salary. As the movie continued to make over $286 million worldwide, both celebrities cheered while watching from the sidelines, but only got what was agreed upon. Additionally, when the grown-ups dealt with the younger cast members were going to experience their own turbulence due to contracts and rewrites. Friedrich, Liesel, and the future stars. The hunt for the Von Trapp kids was anything but yet straightforward, and there was a lot of rivalry. Play the part of the oldest, Liesel. Daughter. Unbelievably, Mia Farrow tried out 3 times as a young girl. She was barely 20, yet delicate and young-faced. The notes from the casting crew were direct, sweet, but without a spark. Not enough energy. Really, you can't dance. That was all. Farrow had left. Ironically, Charmian Carr, the woman who was cast, was actually 21. Not years old. 21 years Farrow's senior. Yes, Carr was chosen to portray 16 while she was in her 20s already. However, she possessed the self-assured radiance that Farrow lacked. An elegant appeal that made every space shine. Missing the Sound of Music could have hurt Farrow, but it paved the way for something even more significant. After only a few years, in Rosemary's Baby, she would terrify everyone, and her career in Hollywood would never be the same. Kurt Russell was among the performers who tried out for the role of Friedrich, the second oldest child. Indeed, Kurt Russell, who would go on to become an action star. Terry Garr and Patty Duke also threw their names. However, Nicholas Hammond, a contemplative 15-year-old, ultimately won the part. The filmmaker admired the child's serene intensity. After a few years, Hammond created history. In a completely different manner, he was the first live-action Spider-Man on 19th century television. The other children of Von Trapp? They were carefully chosen following difficult auditions. The casting crew looked for weeks, occasionally months, until they discovered the ideal personalities, voices, and looks. Additionally, it was a family, not simply a cast. Decades later, the performers who portrayed the children stayed near each other. They frequently got back together, helped one another through life's challenges, and remained in contact with Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews to the very end. Because their friendship was genuine, it felt genuine. The world took note. The box office takeover. One movie dominated the box office for almost 30 years. The box office in Hollywood is like an unchallenged king, gone with the wind. Since its publication in 19, despite wars, golden times, and new technology, it remained unbeaten at the top for 39 years. The Sound of Music followed. In 1995, when it was first launched, no this was anticipated. However, just 18 months later, in November of 1966, it had completed the impractical. It overthrew Gone with the Wind and earned an unprecedented $286 million at the box office worldwide. The problem is that it wasn't inflated. Contemporary currency. Based on the 19th ticket pricing, there were genuine earnings. 1960s, it makes it much more amazing. In other words, The Sound of Music 184 million tickets were sold worldwide. It's almost one out of the 12 individuals that were living at that time. Humming were people who didn't even speak English. Do re mi. People in communities without power were nevertheless able to identify Edelweiss. Additionally, there were no streaming services, online trailers, or viral marketing. Simply positive reviews, radio mentions, word of mouth, and families returning to watch it once, twice, or even 10 times. It evolved beyond a movie. It turned into a worldwide phenomenon. A historical moment shared by people of many ages, nationalities, and languages. The Oscars were the icing on the cake. The Academy Awards were won by The Sound of Music. Won 5: Best Score, Best Sound, Best Editing, Best Director, and Best Picture. After making inroads with West Side Story, director Robert Wise demonstrated that a lightning strike might occur twice. This was no longer only a light-hearted musical. Detractors, it was art, I had to concede. Every subtle piano note, every editing beat, and every technical detail note, and a clear footstep was observed and respected. But what people overlooked, the turbulence behind one of the most romantic passages in the movie was something we were never supposed to know. The gazebo scene disaster, the forbidden scene Maria, and one of the most cherished romance scenes in film history is Captain Von Trapp. You know the one, a slow kiss as they eventually declare their love, soft moonlight, and subdued music. However, you are unaware that filming the sequence was a total failure. The issue? The lights. In particular, the enormous carbon arc lights that are utilized to replicate moonlight. These were loud, hot, and bright industrial machines. Really loud. Not just any loud, either. They produced a sound that was precisely such as a fart. A long, flat, wet raspberry. Each and every time Christopher Plummer bent down to give Julie Andrews a kiss, PPPPFFFTTTT. Repeatedly. According to Julie, they made 20 attempts. However, the lights made the same absurd noise as soon as they were in close proximity to one another's faces. They were giggling uncontrollably. Even the somber phrases, like, Maria, I love you, were ruined by laughing. The crew as a whole was powerless. Hours passed. Nothing was effective. Director Robert Wise eventually gave up. He discarded the initial strategy. No more glaring lights. Rather, he chose to photograph the entire scene in shadow. He positioned Christopher and Julie in front of the windows of a bright gazebo. In this manner, their faces were largely concealed and their laughter was concealed. In the end, it appeared even more romantic. That dreamy, radiant look? That wasn't intentionally. Damage control was the goal. What about the studio? They wished for no one to understand. Fox in the 20th century clamped down. The staff and cast were cautioned not to bring up the sounds, the giggles, or the missed opportunities. Fans believed the scene for years had left without incident. Only decades later did the truth surface when Julie at last, Andrews shared the tale on a talk show. Recalling that, she chuckled, "That's quite difficult to have these terrible feelings while executing a love scene nose to nose. Raspberries are coming at you from below." The audience chuckled, but nobody was aware that Plummer was concealing a much more serious secret. Christopher Plummer's private misery. Although he appeared composed and calm on screen, but he was incredibly miserable off-screen. He hated the sound of music. He mockingly referred to it as the sound of mucus, dubbed it gooey, and even in interviews as just S&M. He felt that the film was extremely romantic and completely out of step with the demanding, serious parts he desired to play. And it was evident. Plummer is frequently alone. Himself in Salzburg during filming. He reportedly remarked that the charming city felt not so much a European vacation as a prison of sentimentality. That included some of his own doing. He drank excessively and then acknowledged that the rich food and drink caused him to put on weight. Nevertheless, he arrived professional at all times. Even when intoxicated, which he freely admitted to later on. He claimed that when he was 3 sheets to the wind, certain shots were shot, including among the film's most poignant scenes. However, in the midst of everything his bitterness, Plummer delivered a performance that would go down in history. The intoxicated scene that moved everyone to tears. There's a scene in the movie that gets. When Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss with tears in his eyes, everyone becomes affected. Throughout the celebration. It seems so genuine and sincere, but here's the twist: Christopher, when they filmed it, Plummer was inebriated. In his 2008 memoir, he admitted, despite himself, he had consumed a lot of alcohol that day. He identified as a young and arrogant bastard who didn't really relate to the melancholy tone of the movie. Nevertheless, he was able to give a performance that touched millions of people. The irony is that The sight, with lots of admirers provide as evidence of his character's emotional development, was performed by an actor who could hardly stand the best or most strange of Hollywood wizardry. However, that wasn't the only setback to his self-esteem. The voice that wasn't his. Are you familiar with the sequences in which Captain Vaughn does trap sing? Yes, that isn't Plummer's singing. Not most of the time, however. It turns out that Bill Lee, a professional, did the high notes and lengthy vocal portions. Singer who also sang vocals for Mary Poppins and Sleeping Beauty, 2 Disney films. Plummer's speaking voice was employed for dialogue and transitions, however when the actual singing began Lee took over, particularly in Edelweiss. Plummer was enraged. He sensed the choice compromised his performance. However, the producers didn't think he could meet the voice requirements. And they weren't taking any chances. Ironically, the majority of fans were unaware. The voice of Lee mixed so well that people continue to think Plummer is singing. By the time the picture was released, Plummer was so irritated that he could hardly utter the movie's name without rolling his eyes. However, he acknowledged decades later that the movie had charmed him in the conclusion. It only took several decades and a significant amount of time away from the limelight for him to observe how it affected the world. And while Plummer was fighting in silence, things on set were becoming frighteningly real for others, in addition to his personal troubles. Filming the day little Gretel almost died in Salzburg was more than just an emotional experience. It was physically hazardous, draining. In the boat scene, the Von Trapp kid's 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played little Gretel, almost drowned after falling into the lake. What actually transpired was that the team notified Julie Andrews shortly prior to filming that Kim was unable to swim. Thus, it was intended that Andrews would approach the youngster when the boat capsized, instantly snagging her. But everything went wrong when the boat capsized. Andrews stumbled backwards, away from Gretel. Before another actor leapt, Kim slipped beneath the water twice in order to extract her. After ingesting lake water, she eventually started to throw up and developed a long-lasting phobia of swimming. Julie Andrews was shook, too. Later, she called one of the scariest scenes on set was the incident. However, it wasn't just Gretel who took filming those now iconic sequences was a hit. The enchanting first scene that everyone recalls Julie Andrews being slammed into the ground. Extended, spinning through a verdant alpine meadow while the camera flies over her. It appears serene, happy, and dreamlike. Here's what the viewers missed, though. A chopper had to fly only 20 feet above her in order to capture that expansive aerial view. Every time the wind from the blades pushed Andrews flat into the grass as they circled about. They knocked her over. Repeatedly, at least 6 or 7 times, and had to keep getting up, dismissing dirt, and grinning as if nothing had occurred. In later interviews, she made light of the fact that she was nearly launched into Austria. Although the moment appeared to be wonderful, filming it felt similar to a full-body tackle from above. A magnificent misfortune in Salzburg. Filming in Salzburg appeared to be a dream come true. Perfect meadows, undulating hills, and a wonderful tale castles were the perfect backdrop for a musical. But there was a terror hidden underneath the beauty. The movie's initial budget was $8.5 million, already pricey for the middle of the 1960s. However, nobody informed the crew that Salzburg had some of Europe's worst weather. In the end, 1964 was one of the wettest years ever recorded. Robert Wise, the director, believed they could wrap in 6 weeks. On-location filming will begin. In the end, it took 11. Everything was delayed by rain to a halt. More than 250 members of the cast and crew sat around in wet clothes, squandering time and going over budget. The price of lodging, equipment maintenance, and additional the studio execs were sweating over lunches and increased pay. Fox was already in shock over the catastrophe. That was Cleopatra, and now this upbeat little musical was on the verge of blowing up just as catastrophically. This movie might be the end of us, a studio insider even muttered. However, there was one more unforeseen change that increased the danger. Long before Robert Wise was employed, the director who left The Sound of Music was intended to be directed by the renowned William Wyler. Within, he even resigned from Fox's board in early 1963 to prevent a confrontation. of interest. It appeared to be that serious. Wyler, however, was skeptical from the beginning. He didn't enjoy the musical on stage. The writing didn't seem to fit him. Even when he departed bewildered after taking a plane to New York to attend the Broadway production. The music didn't suit the plot, but they were natural to him. There was also something else, he said. Wyler was becoming deaf. It increased the difficulty of directing a musical. His spouse it's obvious that he wasn't interested in it. Wyler then started discreetly searching for a way out. A clean break that wouldn't spark suspicion was what he needed. At that point, based on the John Fowles book, producers offered him The Collector. Wyler perused the script and realized right away that this was more in line with his dark, twisted, psychological style. He requested his freedom from the Zanuck family, who were in charge of the studio. From his contract with Sound of Music. The official narrative? Scheduling disputes. That's what the media was informed. That was what Fox said again. In actuality, though, Wyler fled in the opposite direction. And that made room for Robert Wise, who entered in the late 19th century. The pieces will be picked up by 63. I appreciate you watching, family. If you had fun, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel after watching this video. See the upcoming video that appears on your screen.